Good morning. We're just getting ready to start the broadcast. We're waiting for just a couple of more people to sign on. We'll start in about a minute. Good. Okay, good morning. It looks like we have about a full house right now, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Good morning and welcome to our first virtual CFO Focus webcast. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Kathleen Alexander and I'm a partner with Sax, and I will be hosting this webcast for today. For those of you who may not know Sax very well, we are a top 100 accounting tax advisory firm serving privately held companies, publicly owned businesses, non-for-profit organizations, and high net worth individuals. Through the CFO Focus series seminars, we strive to bring timely and actionable business advice on the issues and challenges faced by CFOs and other financial managers. Obviously, with the current pandemic, there is much to talk about. But before I introduce our featured guest speakers, I wanted to share with you some exciting updates at Sax. In April, we announced our joint venture with Safari Solutions. We formed S2 Technology Solutions. This partnership will further enhance Sax's technology services to our clients, which is now more important than ever as we rely on technology to keep businesses operating remotely. I'm happy to chat with anyone who'd like to learn more, or you can visit s2technologysolutions.com to find out more information about the partnership. In addition, in order to keep up with all the tax changes and the new information for both individuals and businesses being released under the CARES Act and the supplemental stimulus packages, we have created our own Sax COVID-19 team who continues to hold a weekly recovery update webinar every Thursday at 10 a.m. Each week, we recap the ongoing guidance issued on the loan programs and tax incentives for COVID-19 relief made available to all of us. Just this past Friday, further information was released on the loan forgiveness requirements and review procedures the SBA will undertake for the Paycheck Protection Program. You can register for these webinars by going to our website. In addition, you can find recordings of the prior webinars and other resources in our COVID-19 Resource Center, located on our website under saxllp.com. So, back to our topic for today. I'd like to welcome our featured guest speakers, Lauren Hollender and Julie Levinson Werner from Lowenstein Sandler, who will discuss recommended guidelines and key safety and health considerations to evaluate from a legal standpoint before entering the workplace. I'm going to hand it over to you, Julie and Lauren.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. This is Julie Werner at Lowenstein Sandler, and I'm here this morning with my colleague Lauren Hollender. We are at Lowenstein Sandler. Lowenstein Sandler is a law firm. We have over 300 attorneys located in Roseland, New Jersey, New York City, Palo Alto, Washington, D.C., and Utah. And across the country, obviously, this is a topic that we're getting a lot of questions and feedback, and I'm sure most of you, obviously, on the phone as well, this is something that's top of mind for everyone. So if we move to the next slide, you can see generally the topics that we intend to cover this morning. Our intention is to go through these things and give you some information that hopefully will be of use to you. We are also available to answer questions during the presentation. as we can, as well as obviously any follow-up. Our contact information is at the end of the presentation, and we welcome any inquiries if you have follow-up questions. So this morning, what we're going to first start with is a discussion about workplace entry and screening. What happens now, if and when, as you start to open, things to be thinking about in terms of getting people in the door, whether or not to test, screen, temperature checks, things of that nature. There are lots of concerns that people have, obviously continuing about workplace safety, the CDC, OSHA, and workers' compensation issues we will spend some time on. What happens then when you get people back to work? And unfortunately, which seems inevitable in this situation, you may still have suspected or confirmed cases of employees who are sick or family members who are sick. We'll talk about how to manage that. Now that everybody or many businesses have gotten comfortable working from home, you may have employees who don't want to return to work, or you may particularly have employees who are more vulnerable in terms of either their age or a medical condition. We'll talk about how to manage those concerns. And then finally, talking about what policies you either have already in place or should be adopting with respect to vacation sick and some of the childcare issues that folks are facing. So Lauren's going to start now and talk about some issues particularly related to workplace entry and screening.
Good morning. I'm Lauren Hollender. So once employers get past the can we reopen and when do we reopen, employers must next face the question, well, how are we getting everyone safely in the door? And now temperature checks and health inquiries have become the hot topic. A couple of months ago, employer-mandated temperature checks and health inquiries would have been considered overbroad medical exams under the Americans with Disabilities Act. However, in the midst of this pandemic, temperature screenings have now become sanctioned and in some jurisdictions mandatory. So a lot of this is going to require on the ground looking at the laws and knowing where your work sites are and knowing what applies. The U.S. EEOC has recently published guidelines giving employers the green light to implement temperature checks during the COVID-19 pandemic. And even according to the CDC, employers need to keep employees who register a temperature of 100.4, that's the magical number, not 98.7. They need to keep those employees out of the workplace. They shouldn't be allowed in, or if they manage to have a temperature midday or something, you discover it, they need to be sent home. So what do employers need to do? And there's really a decision matrix that needs to go on in terms of all the different things you need to consider. And unfortunately, there are a lot of operational issues here that employers in the professional business setting have never really had to address. And further, unfortunately, there's no one size fits all. A lot of this in terms of how you're going to conduct these screenings and temperature checks and inquiries is going to depend upon the composition of your workforce, who's coming where, what day, and what the layout of your space is. Obviously, screening is going to look a lot different for a small office and a standalone business than it is for somebody in a New York high-rise that has multiple different businesses entering through one place. So the first question then is, do we have to conduct temperature checks? And while not mandated in most locations at present, the laws are constantly changing and they're starting to crop up requiring screening. For example, in Pennsylvania, now they recently enacted a law that requires employers to implement on-site temperature screening once an employer learns that a probable or confirmed case of COVID-19 had occurred on the premises. New York has joined the mix, and one of the handouts we'll have for you at the end of this is a New York safety template. New York has now issued its New York Forward Reopening Plan. I encourage you all, if you're operating in New York, to go online and take a look. It's rather comprehensive, and all businesses will be required to develop a written COVID-19 reopening safety plan prior to reopening. You can either use the safety plan template online, which has a lot of questions for you to address on an operational basis. Again, they give you, open-ended questions that you're all going to need to complete very differently based upon your place of business. You can draft your own safety template, but the point is to have it available for both inspectors and employees. And the plan goes a long way in terms of keeping employees calm. If you're you're sharing information and putting it out there for employees, employees will know you're thinking about keeping them safe and that you've actually visited certain things ahead of time, and they'll be happier coming back to your workplace. So returning again to the temperature checks, the question is, are you going to do this on site, or are you going to have employees self-screen? And if you're going to do this on site, you have to determine what is your process. Some states require notice to employees. For example, California has a Privacy Act, and you're going to require authorization. You're going to need to think through who is taking the temperatures. Do you hire a healthcare professional? Those are hard to come by these days. Can you get a nurse? Can you get an EMT? Someone from a lab like Quest. I know our company is in contact with Quest Diagnostic, and it's our understanding that they're making people available to conduct these screenings. If you have screenings on site, what quality control and personal protective equipment is required for the screener? You need masks, gloves, face shields. And then if this person is conducting this, what's going to happen when someone does register a temperature? Quest at least has said to us, or at least that's our understanding, they're not sending anyone home. That's the employer's responsibility. So then do you need a member of HR present? And how, practically speaking, are you going to tell people that they need to go home? During this whole process, if you're going to do it on site, you need to think about maintaining proper social distancing. Are you going to have people standing in line? Are you going to stagger entry times, that people come at different times and aren't there? And if they are waiting in line, you have to consider for non-exempt employees that this is compensable time and that they'll need to be recording it and that you'll need to pay them for that time. Then you have to determine what is the employer's obligation with respect to confidentiality. If you do have information that says they have a fever or other health conditions, the ADA requires that the information containing in the health information be placed in a separate confidential medical file. So these are all things you need to start talking about, all right? So now we're on the next screen. Yes, thank you. So if we don't have to screen on site, should we? Rather than in-person screening, you may want to direct employees to self-screen at home prior to coming to work and acknowledging each morning that they are fever-free. Of course, the flaw here is that employees might acknowledge without actually checking, and you're not sure whether they're actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. Again, there are many operational issues to address in self-screening, like how are the employees submitting acknowledgements? You can't just have a New York template, you'll see, you can't simply say, don't come to work if you have a fever and rely upon the theory, no news is good news. Rather, there has to be evidence of some type of affirmative screening on a daily basis and someone really monitoring who's coming in the door. So that being said, how are you going to have acknowledgements submitted? Is there some type of intranet on your workspace where you can create these kind of acknowledgements, questions, and have them answer, and each day show that they have no symptoms or fever that prohibits their entry to the workplace. This is burdensome, but it's going to become the new normal. And I think, I'm getting a lot of questions from employers on a practical level of how to do this. Am I collecting paper? Am I not collecting paper? These are all things that are just being worked out now. There are a lot of apps in development, and you should try to keep yourself apprised of what's going on. United Healthcare, at least I saw on the news, and Microsoft have announced that they will launch Protect Well protocol and an app to support return to work planning and COVID-19 symptom screenings. So it might make sense to check with your insurer whether there are any apps they're making available in the near future. Also, if you have a professional employer organization, you might want to check with them whether they have available resources. I think at the moment, everyone's just trying to, get the lay of the land here and figure out their options in terms of conducting this screening process. The screening process will have to happen, at least in New York. And then you're not done when you end with your temperature checks. You need to ask additional questions. So in New York, again, on this template, you're going to see the screening process also requires you to ask these two questions. And I added a third, which is less relevant today, I'll get to, but nonetheless, you might want to keep it on your questionnaire if you're developing one. So question one has to be, in the past 14 days, now I just changed it to 14 days per New York, have you had any, these things change daily, have you had any COVID-19 symptoms? And for that, you have to go to the CDC website, which if you type in Google CDC symptoms for COVID-19, you'll get to their site. And I swear it is changing daily. This list keeps growing, it keeps changing, but now the things I've listed here, cough, shortness of breath, difficulty breathing, fever, chills, muscle pain, sore throat, new loss of taste or smell. Those are all things that are on the CDC website in terms of symptoms. So this, again, your questionnaire or whatever inquiry you're making on a daily basis before entry needs to ask these questions. Then question 2 is, in the past 14 days, have you been in close contact? And that's defined by the CDC as 10 minutes or more within less than 6 feet of someone with a person with a confirmed or suspected case of COVID-19. So you're not only concerned with whether the employee himself or herself is sick. What if they have loved ones at home or they're caring for people? You don't want them in your workplace as well. So you're screening people for whether or not they're having close contact with suspected or confirmed cases. And the third question, which is kind of dropped off the map for now while travel is restricted, but might reemerge and you should keep in mind, is have you recently traveled to a restricted area that is under a level 2, 3, or 4 travel advisory, according to the U.S. Department of State. So that being said, that's your screening of employees, but that's not where your thought process has to end. You need to think about visitor screening protocol as well. And I haven't seen it where they're requiring you to screen all customers. No supermarket is stopping me at the door yet and asking me to answer any of these questions. But certainly the New York template is talking about visitor screening to your workplace. And so you may have to put something up. The first step would be putting signage on the workplace door indicating that there is a restricted entry to the work site, that they have to complete some type of questionnaire or some query before getting there. If you have on-site testing, obviously you can screen your visitors in the same manner in which you're screening your employees. But if you don't, if you've utilized these questionnaires and require some type in terms of a daily acknowledgement, you really need to identify an employer gatekeeper for visitor access and maybe want to direct all employees to that gatekeeper, who will then have the names of people who are coming to the site and will arrange to send them some email or some questionnaire prior to entry and make sure that they've all been appropriately screened. So that, again, is what you need to do with visitors and employees. And tracking is going to be very important. And I'll get to that in my next section when I speak after Julie again on terms of protocol and responding to an active case on your premises. But the New York State template and the safety plan is recommending employers maintain a continuous log of every person, including workers and visitors, excluding customers who may have come into close contact with other individuals at work. So again, another on-the-ground operational thing for employers to address that they never previously had to address. And this tracking access will become very important if and when someone does wind up in your workplace with a positive or suspected case. So with that, I'm going to end this section. I don't know, Kathleen, whether there are any questions, and then we can go on to Julie after any questions.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, I have a couple of questions I'd like to ask. First, going back to your temperature check slide at the beginning, it said, what is the employer's obligation with respect to confidentiality? So the question, what does the employer need to put in the employee's personnel file?
Okay, good question. So nothing in the personnel file, because anything with respect to medical information is considered a confidential medical record, which needs to be kept separate from the personnel file. So then you need to create a protected confidential medical file for this employee that's kept separate and that is only, accessed by people with legitimate reason to know. So you would not have to treat it that way. And I guess on that front, a lot of employers have been asking, and I don't have a clear answer on this. I think this is a work in process. In terms of keeping confidentiality, if you're screening at the door also, if you're just immediately saying no to people as soon as they register a temperature, you're kind of disclosing the fact that they're sick. So some employers, I think that's perfectly fine if that does happen. I mean, your obligation is to keep sick people outside of the workplace. but some employers sensitive to that are trying to devise ways in terms of different movements of line so that it doesn't become evident to everyone else when someone has a fever.
Great, thank you very much. And then I have another question. What happens, and you touched on this a little bit, when someone comes to the entrance and they're signing in and maybe they have a cough, but it's really due to allergies? How are we going to deal with other symptoms that are similar to allergy symptoms?
That's a good question. I don't have a clear, definite answer for you. I think, you know, in this day and age, I would err on the side of asking them to leave, and then I would rectify the problem, you know, in telephone communications after that, in terms of them, you know, showing you that it's truly allergy related. If I'm seeing symptoms that I'm concerned about, I think my first reaction would be to ask them to leave and then address it later.
That's right. They can provide you with a doctor's note, but absolutely, you want to send. It's hard to distinguish. Somebody has a cough; it's not clear why. You would send them home and let them provide you with some type of follow-up doctor's note from their physician.
Great, thank you. And then I have another question. The handout that you referred to, the New York Forward Safety Plan template for New York, is that for companies that have a certain number of employees, or is that for everybody that has one employee and up?
I'm seeing it right now, and I have to look at it. It just came out, but I'm seeing it for all employers in the business setting. So I would look carefully at that, and I think that's for everyone.
Okay, and then the follow-up question is, does New Jersey have a similar template or game plan or tracking protocol that we can look at?
Not yet, but I find that that New Jersey, I'm in New Jersey, that we seem to follow on the heels of New York. So you know, this whole idea of a safety template, the thing, you know, it was funny, we were creating these safety policies for employers prior to the template coming out, and we really did hit all the high notes. I mean, so I think that the items that you need to address in the New York template with respect to social distancing, with respect to screening, I think they're going to be commonplace in most states.
Okay, and then the one last question for this area is, does it provide guidance that says that the person taking the temperature has to be a healthcare professional?
It does not.
Okay, good. That's all I have for now.
Okay. Julie, I'll turn to you.
Okay, thank you. So obviously, as we can see, these are all issues that reflect issues regarding workplace safety. And as we're saying, it's important to develop a safety policy. And so the template that we've referred to, essentially, this is going to be something that should be a living document. It's essentially, what you want to do is you want to create, you know, and this is the case, you'll hear us oftentimes on various topics in employment law, talking about documentation. So it's important to really, the purpose is to document what you're doing. So you're going to want to develop a safety policy that documents the steps that you're taking, the actions. And again, it's going to be a living document that will continue to evolve as things change. You're going to want to first start by designating a pandemic coordinator. In all likelihood, you're going to, you know, want to have a committee of people, typically somebody in human resources. Typically, there'll be an operational person or facilities management person, and other areas that are appropriate for your business. Essentially identifying areas related to, as we mentioned, workplace entry and screening. Who's going to be handling this? Measures to ensure social distancing. We're seeing these, you know, stickers and different markings that businesses are placing on the ground to help people determine 6 feet measurements. Cleaning and disinfecting. Even if you're not intending to open for a couple weeks or a couple months, you don't want to wait till someone gets sick to first now figure out how are you going to disinfect. You want to develop a plan now. You want to start researching and having vendors available. You're going to want to document what's going to happen if somebody gets sick in the workplace. And so again, this is all going to go in your policy. And it's going to be, as I said, a living document that will continue to evolve as these things, you're going to figure it out. You may not get it right the first time. And so it's really just sort of documenting what you're doing and communicating in these various areas, leaves of absence, workplace accommodation, as we say. And so developing, even with respect to social distancing, we're starting to hear different businesses think about having different people work on different days. Obviously, this is dependent on the nature of your business. Some businesses, this will work easier than others. Many businesses that have, in professional services who have had their employees work from home may find that they have employees who are not so eager to return. And, I think having a dialogue, and this is the case for lots of these areas, having a dialogue with your employees is more important now than ever. You want to keep them engaged. You want them to know that you're being responsive and attentive to these areas. And people often have good ideas. And so letting employees know that if they have suggestions or feedback, that you're amenable to that, and updating your policies accordingly if you get suggestions and things that are workable. You also want to identify and be prepared to supply the required personal protective equipment. You don't want to wait till you're about to get back to work to then try to figure out how you're going to order masks, for example. We're going to move to the next slide. But so you're going to want to research, how am I going to get masks? How frequently do we expect we're going to need them? And frankly, part of the issue is, how are you going to enforce these things? Are we going to say that people, anytime they walk in the hallway, they need to wear a mask, but if they're sitting in their cube or their office, that they don't? What happens if people don't listen? You're going to have somebody who's going to be designated essentially the hall monitor, or the bouncer, so to speak, and have to discipline people or frankly, kick people out if they're not in compliance. You want to develop a plan. You want to make sure it's a plan that you can follow, but you also don't want to overcommit or make commitments on things that you're not going to be prepared to follow through on. So you're going to want to identify and come up with what works and is appropriate for your business. Obviously, lots of signs. There's going to be lots of hand sanitizer that people are going to need to purchase. And so you want to start planning for these things. As we mentioned, there's great information that continues to come out almost daily on the CDC website. We have the links, and you'll get a copy of this PowerPoint so you can access these specific links. There's lots of FAQs. OSHA, many businesses, unless you've been in manufacturing or a factory type environment, many businesses really have never paid much attention to OSHA. But now, obviously, given what's going on, that's something new that businesses are now needing to pay more attention to. And so with respect to even issues like OSHA or workers' comp, again, unless you've been in a manufacturing type environment, many businesses have not really paid attention to those areas. So you want to think about, and a lot of questions we've been getting relate to issues about potential liability. What is our risk? What happens if somebody gets sick? Can they sue us? There's talk on Capitol Hill about this phrase, what's been referred to as a liability shield. Now, with respect to employees in the normal course should not have a legal basis to sue their employer if they get sick, because that's precisely what workers' comp is intended to cover. So in the normal course, if an employee were to be injured at work, in the easiest, not an ideal example, but somebody is working in a machine and their finger gets cut off, bad scenario, but it's clear that there's causation. It's clear that it happened at work. And in the normal course, that'd be something covered by workers' comp. However, if an employee, if the employer, I should say, did something that was essentially, and the legal standard will vary by state, but essentially if the employer engaged in some willfully egregious activity, did something intentionally malicious, altered the machine, if the machine is supposed to run at a certain speed and the machine now, the employer wants people working faster and they change the machine, it's essentially, if you engage in a manner that is of heightened, again, the language will vary by state, but essentially if you do something egregious, malicious, you may not be covered by workers' comp, but in the ordinary course, you should. Obviously also an employee, as in the example of the finger, it's clear that it happened at work. How can an employee prove, even if they get sick, that it happened at work? There certainly are going to be causation issues because as we said, you can go to the supermarket, you can go anywhere and potentially get sick. So that may be an issue. Some states are addressing that now by essentially saying that if an employee gets sick within 14 days of being at work, that it's presumed that they got sick at work. And the purpose of that, and ideally, again, mostly where we're starting to see that is with respect to healthcare workers. But the goal is to make sure that these people get coverage and treatment. But so we'll start to see changes and updates in the workers' comp standards with respect to COVID. And again, essentially many states moving towards this notion of being presumed if you get sick within 14 days that you that it's a workplace injury. Some companies are thinking about whether or not to have employees sign liability waivers, question being whether they're enforceable. Generally speaking, I would not hang my hat on a liability waiver, certainly not for an employee. With respect to visitors, that may be something, I mean, look, I guess it's akin to when you go and walk into the amusement park, or you go skiing, or you go in some other high risk activity and you sign your liability waiver. Sometimes they're enforceable, sometimes they're not. It's obviously very fact specific, and I don't think there's clear guidance. I think we'll start to see more along the lines of sort of what becomes market, what becomes typical. I wouldn't expect to see a flood of employee waivers or having employers have employees sign waivers before they return, and I wouldn't expect that to be typically considered enforceable. But it sort of remains to be seen from a market standpoint how those things go. So we can move to the next slide, or there may be some questions. Actually, let's just, if we can just, yeah, maybe now's a good point to stop for some questions.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions lining up here. One is, we have someone that's going to send out a questionnaire to employees asking them if there's no vaccine yet, will they return to work? If we do that, we have to make sure that's confidential, and is it allowable?
So you're certainly allowed to, and we're increasingly seeing companies send out surveys to their employees asking questions. The thing is, whatever question you ask, you have to be prepared for the answer, and you want to be receptive to the feedback. If the question is, for example, to say, are you willing to come back if there's no vaccine? I don't think anybody expects there to be a vaccine anytime soon, unfortunately. And so, you know, I guess the question is, maybe a better question is to say, at what point would you feel comfortable, or what suggestions do you have, and things of that nature? Because look, if you get 100% of the people saying we don't feel comfortable and we don't want to come back until a vaccine, and then, you know, the next week, next month, you say everybody back, people are going to feel like, well, why are they asking me these questions if they're not receptive to my answer? Obviously, it also is dependent on the nature of your business. I think we're all seeing there's going to be a cultural shift with respect to employees working from home. Many businesses that previously were not receptive have seen over the past couple months, and obviously depending on the nature of the business, but I think more people are surprised that it's worked out better than expected. But again, I would think about and be mindful of the specific questions being asked, and just be prepared. Whatever the answers you get, you're going to have to react to them. So you want to be thoughtful exactly about what you're asking.
Okay. The next question is about masks. Do we have to force the employees to wear masks? Is there a work environment that will allow us not to have to wear masks?
So I think the general guidance is that if there's any chance that you're going to be within less than 6 feet from someone, which could happen if you're walking or passing someone in the hallway, what we're tending to see is the notion of, in public areas, requiring employees to wear masks. Less applicable if somebody, again, is sitting in a private office or a private cubicle area. I know people are looking into area, you know, things with respect to plexiglass, or again, social distancing, having employees sit every other cube or every other office. So I think, look, there's no clear answer in the sense that if you're within your office setting, there's no mandate that you must wear masks. But a lot of this, again, goes to the notion of reasonableness. And as I said, I'm not here to say that if nobody wears masks and all of a sudden somebody gets sick, that all of a sudden it's not covered by workers' comp. But as I said, when you go towards this notion of reasonableness and sort of what reasonable steps and measures are being taken, you want to be able to say that you took all appropriate measures that were recommended. You want to document that you've done that. And so if you ignore certain recommended guidance, it puts yourself at heightened risk, or puts your business at heightened risk that you weren't following recommended steps.
Okay, and then one last question. Do you have an opinion about whether people wear their own masks versus a mask provided by their employer?
I would say, look, I would encourage employees to wear their own masks and bring them. Frankly, I guess it depends on the nature of the business, but if they're traveling, you know, certainly on public transportation, that they should be wearing masks. But I think the employer has to assume, you know, the case of the dog, you know, the dog ate my homework. Somebody comes to work and they say, oh, I forgot my mask. I think you have to assume that you should have many extras available, and not count on the employee having brought their own.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. So we're going to move now to what happens now that you're at work and you still have employees. Unfortunately, this condition is not going to disappear overnight. So what happens and what's the protocol to responding to suspected or confirmed cases? And Lauren will address that.
Right. So at this point, employers are starting to come to the realization that it's not a matter of if, but when this happens in their workplace. And you really need to be prepared. This is not something you should be addressing when it happens, but rather be thinking through right now, how are we going to deal with this? Again, in terms of communication with employees, I again think that this is something that you should be addressing and communicating with employees so that they again feel that you're on this, that you've shared this with them, that you have a plan. And I think in this time, employees need information from employers. I know us as a work office, we have a weekly kind of State of the Union address by our firm leader that lets us know where we are in terms of business, where we are in terms of thinking, in terms of reopening, et cetera. So I think your protocol for responding is, again, one of the many items that you want to show employees you've thought through, documented, and you're sharing. There's some very useful guidance on the website. Those sites that are listed in our slides that you'll be given talk about CDC FAQs for businesses that really talk about just this situation and how you're supposed to address it, and have very detailed information about how to, who needs to be quarantined for how long, what and when you can accept an employee back into the workplace. So I'm just going to go through this quickly so we stay on track time-wise. So first and foremost, you really need to, again, another coordinating person, someone you never had needed in the workplace before, but someone to coordinate your response in the event of an outbreak. We're calling it a pandemic coordinator. It might be your HR person. Again, have someone that knows they are wearing this hat. You need to direct all supervisors to report COVID-related symptoms or illnesses in the workplace to this person. Employees who have, and then you need a plan if someone develops symptoms in the middle of the day or you discover symptoms. To minimize exposure, potentially infectious people should be asked to move to a location away from other employees and visitors, preferably in a room with closable doors that may serve as an isolation room until the potentially sick person can be safely removed. Have a game plan. What are you going to do if somebody develops symptoms midday? Employees who develop symptoms outside the work should be notifying their supervisors and stay home. And sick employees are have to be advised to follow CDC recommended steps. On the website is namely to stay home, get medical care, separate themselves from others, monitor their symptoms, and follow care instructions from a healthcare provider. The sick employee should not return to work until they've met CDC criteria to discontinue home isolation. And there's no test to saying that you're done and over with this and no longer contagious. So rather, the guidance on the CDC website goes into a symptom-based or a test-based strategy. There really is no test yet to say that you don't have contagious symptoms anymore. So that's, or if there is one, it's not readily available. So basically on the website for the CDC, they're saying that persons with COVID-19 who have symptoms and were directed to care for themselves at home may discontinue isolation when at least 3 days or 72 hours have passed since recovery, defined as resolution of fever without the use of any fever reducing medication, or at least 10 days have passed since the symptoms have first appeared. And I know that this makes employers very uncomfortable when to let people back in the workplace. So I think, we'll be looking to CDC guidance on this subject and to healthcare providers' recommendations. So once you've determined who this person is, you need HR to identify and contact employees, customers, and visitors who may have been exposed. And again, the New York template is now saying if a worker tests positive for COVID-19, the employer must immediately notify state and local health departments and cooperate in contact tracing. Let's see, are we on the next slide? Let's see. Yeah, let's go to the next slide. All right, well, not there. And then in accordance with CDC recommendations, the HR person is supposed to identify people who have come into, and this is a term of art now, close contact with someone that's defined by the CDC as less than 6 feet for 10 or more minutes or a longer period of time. It's interesting, during the 48 hours before symptoms onset. So this kind of goes a little bit against what New York has. New York is asking you whether you've had contact in the past 14 days with anyone who's symptomatic, whereas if you go on the CDC website, it's telling you that you need to tell people to isolate if they've had contact with someone during the 48 hours before symptoms began in that person. Once you identify who has had contact that meets that, then you should tell them to quarantine for the next 14 days. Let's see, I think I might be ahead of myself on the slides. Let's see, we're in the cleaning. We're not right there. Yeah, if you don't mind, why don't you go back to the prior slide? I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself in terms of telling you to move on. All right, so the HR, once they know who's been in close contact with this person who has become symptomatic or has tested positive, they identify the people with close contact, you notify them. You cannot identify the name of the individual who was sick. That's protected by law under the Americans with Disabilities Act. You may ask this person whether or not they can provide disclosure of their name, but that person in that instance should provide a written authorization allowing you to disclose their name. And certainly you shouldn't put any pressure on this person to do that. Obviously, I think people feel better when you don't just say someone in the workplace that may have been near you was sick. When you tell them exactly who it was, it gives them more comfort being able to assess, was I really near Joe? How close was I to Joe all day now that I know that Joe tested positive? But that's something you're going to have to work around in terms of people's comfort identifying themselves. Okay, now I really am on the next slide. All right. So you've identified, your HR person has notified legal authority or health authorities. They've now identified who may have been in close contact with the person. They've notified those people to stay home from the workplace for 14 days. You now need to direct cleaning at the workplace, and your cleaning coordinator should direct appropriate responsive office sanitizing and cleanings. So areas used for a prolonged period of time by the infected individual need to be closed off if necessary and cleaned in accordance with CDC cleaning guidance. Again, that is online. Other areas potentially visited by this individual need to be cleaned. And if the office is a shared office building, the company should notify building management so they can take any precautions that they deem necessary. Beyond that, again, in terms of keeping employees informed, I think employers are making different decisions on this. I would go one way in terms of, do you notify others who might not have been in close contact? My gut feeling is that you may want to send something to the rest of the office, just saying someone who was suspected or confirmed to have the disease was identified, and that you've affirmatively notified those people who had close contact, and you're just notifying the rest of the office to just monitor signs and symptoms of COVID-19 and not to report to work should they experience symptoms. I think this could have a calming effect on employees to know that you've taken care of that, you've notified people, you've cleaned the place, let employees know that you've taken care of things. So with that, I'm going to stop for questions and then move on to Julie. Kathleen?
Just to be clear, let's assume that we have an employee who wakes up in the morning and doesn't feel well. They're going to notify their employer that they're not feeling well, not sure whether it's COVID or something else. What should the protocol be for that individual in order to get them back to work?
Well, to get them back to work, I think you keep them home until they've consulted with a healthcare professional in terms of, and then just determine what the symptoms are all about. If there are symptoms that are on the CDC list, I think you have to keep them home and have them consult with a healthcare professional. Now, the CDC is saying you can't require doctor's notes, but I think you can certainly require telehealth appointments and some, information from a healthcare professional about what's going on there. So my recommendation would be to have them continue to monitor, their health and decide from there what happens.
Yeah, I would just add to that, again, I think with the advent of this telehealth where people can more readily access doctors or, visits through just online or phone calls and things, I think for companies, getting somebody else to sort of confirm whether or not there's something going on or not and saying that there's asking for a doctor's note. I think if they're continuing to experience symptoms, the short of it is, employers have a lot more latitude on these areas than they ever have in the past. We have to obviously be careful about discrimination, and we'll get to that in a moment. But overall, again, we're talking about public health and safety. So I would say where employers may have been a little more shy about taking an aggressive position, all in all, employers have more latitude now than they ever have before in terms of ensuring a safe workplace.
And then with that, the employers also seem to have more responsibility.
Well, yes, that's true. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's all I have for that section.
Okay. So with respect to vulnerable employees, so this is a careful area where we need to be mindful of making sure that we're not discriminating or making assumptions about certain people, at the same time engaging in a discussion. So there's always a tension, and this is, I guess, the lawyer typical answer of, there's no absolute answers on these things. On the one hand, employers have a responsibility to, as we said, have a safe workplace, and to, as always has been the case, if an employee had come to you and said they had some type of disability and they needed an accommodation, an employer needs to engage in an interactive dialogue to see what type of accommodation. And in many instances, working from home, especially in the case of depending on the nature of the job, where employees have been able to work from home successfully over the past couple of months, that is in all likelihood a reasonable accommodation for somebody who says to you that they have an underlying medical condition. Now, just because somebody is older, over the age of 65, for example, doesn't automatically make them disabled per se. But I do believe at least the guidance that's coming from the CDC does seem to suggest that older individuals are at a heightened risk. And so, again, I think it is very job specific. It's very dependent upon the nature of the business. But all in all, and look, again, as you just said, employers, as we said, have a heightened responsibility, as well as the ability, again, can take a more aggressive position on some of these things than they may have in the past. But with that, as you noted, Kathleen, have a heightened sense of responsibility. So along those lines, if you have somebody who is over 65 or has one of these medical conditions and is saying, I don't feel comfortable coming back to work, I do think that employers need to be more flexible. And what that may mean, especially, look, again, I think a lot of this is trust and then verify, asking for a doctor's note. And I frankly think that if somebody were older or had one of these conditions and in saying to them, look, I need a doctor's note, just that this is your doctor's recommendation, as is the case if anybody said I need some type of accommodation to work from home. So if an employee goes through the step of getting a doctor's note and the doctor's note is recommending that they be able to continue to work from home, again, depending on the nature of the job, depending on whether or not that's feasible, I would say that that is definitely something that an employer should do as best as they can. Again, where sometimes people start to ask questions, one person says, well, why does that person get to work from home and I can't work from home? A lot of it is very much on a need to know basis. And so just because somebody asks you that question doesn't mean they're entitled to an answer. So if two people have the exact same job and one is told they have to come back to work and one is told that they're able to work from home because either they're older or they have some medical condition, I think you just have to say to the other employee, essentially and politely, mind your own business, or we're assessing each situation on a case-by-case basis. But again, there may also be some positions or businesses where working from home is not feasible. And that's where we go back and we look at the Family Medical Leave Act, or other states have their state leave laws, where an employee may be entitled to either protected leave of absence, or frankly, it may end up just being an unpaid leave of absence. All in all, right? I mean, we're all going through a difficult time here. And so, as we note, the CDC guidance says that employers should take care to try to reduce vulnerable workers' risk. And so, again, it's not making an assumption or mandating that just because somebody is older or has a condition that they can't work, but being accommodating when and how possible to try to prevent putting those employees at risk or putting your other employees at risk in those situations. So if we can move to the next slide, what we want to just mention, and many of you may have been aware of this law was passed, I guess became effective as of April 1st, the Families First Corona Response Act. So many of you probably have had to deal with this already, but as you may know, in addition to whatever paid sick leave laws that you may already have had, now under this federal law, employers are required to provide of a certain size. You have to have less than 500 employees and other sort of minimal conditions, but generally speaking, up to 10 days of paid sick leave if an employee falls under one of the categories that's listed here. There's 6 categories, but essentially whether or not the employee has been advised to self-quarantine or whether the employee is experiencing symptoms. But the payment, and again, obviously depends on the job, but for most positions, as we said, it requires only partial payment of $511 a day for certain reasons. And then other reasons with respect to childcare, it's $200 a day. And so another thing to think about is whether or not you want to have the employee use other available paid time off that they have to sort of supplement and get them to their regular pay, because the requirement to provide payment under this law is not at their 100% regular salary. It has this cap. So that's something certainly to think about as well, recognizing also that employees may ask for and be entitled to intermittent leave. So especially in the case of, for example, caring for a child because their school or place of care has closed, you need to consider whether or not providing them with intermittent leave. As we noted, their FAQs, and there's lots of specifics, questions and answers, and so that also continues to be updated, and we have the link to the DOL site. Moving on to the next slide. So essentially, again, a lot of parents and have struggled and tried to manage in terms of dealing with caring for their children while in the case of working from home. But if they still have time available, because frankly, if this law began as of April 1, and if you've encountered this issue, the 12 weeks is likely to be up soon. But in the case of even continuing through the summer, if the child otherwise would have had some type of daycare or camp or something like that, and that place is now closed, essentially the law or the FAQ suggests that they would still be entitled to this time if they still have it available under the federal Family First Corona Response Act. In addition to your regular paid sick leave laws, the New York quarantine leave law also provides for additional time. And so even in the past, under the paid sick leave laws that identified reasons, they've been amended also to address COVID-related reasons. And also, I mean, if an employee has certain ongoing conditions, they may be entitled to paid family leave, has always been the case under certain standards under New York and New Jersey, for example, and or short-term disability benefits. So these are all areas to explore. These are all areas where you need to be communicating to your employees in terms of what's available to them. And I would also, again, remind you about the notion even of an unpaid leave of absence. And so it may not be a, quote, protected leave of absence, but again, in the notion of trying to be accommodating, trying to work with people. Obviously, you're running a business, and we recognize that. And so we're not here to say you have to completely give away the farm. But at the same time, it's a challenging situation for everyone. And if these are employees who are valuable to you, you can certainly, expect your employees will appreciate, and it will go a long way. Certainly it's times like this where people sort of, either step up and see how they're being treated, and it can certainly engender loyalty when they see how their employer is handling these situations. The other thing to think about more generally, and we've gotten a few inquiries about this, as travel now starts to become more open, do you want to limit travel? Can you limit travel even in practice? If employees want to now take their vacation time this summer, do you have the right to tell them whether or not they can travel or not, or whether they're required to inform you? And the CDC website still suggests that if an employee travels internationally, that you are within your right to quarantine them upon their return. But what that also could do is essentially give them another 2-week vacation, even if it's unpaid. So I don't know that you can actually mandate in terms of prohibiting employees from traveling in their personal time, but you can certainly discourage it, and you should have a conversation, and also just think about what you want to do with respect to PTO. If you are now finally returning to work, and you want to tell employees, we're not going to allow you to take vacation this summer. Everybody is, maybe depending on your business, people have not been working as actively over the past couple months. And once you start to open up, you're going to need their time and attention. You can just say vacation is not available until the fall. You have your right to sort of regulate the timing of when people take vacation. Alternatively, if you're trying to stagger when people are coming back, you may want to mandate that certain people take vacation at certain points in time and use their PTO, so you can ensure that they're being paid even if you don't have work to do or you're staggering their presence in the office. So these are things that are continuing to grow, evolve. As we mentioned, there are recommended templates. They continue to change. This is going to be a living document. There are no, as you hear, some of these things are clear cut, and on some of these things, there's no clear answer, and certainly we'll have to wait and see how things go. But we're happy to answer any further questions that you all have, and we certainly will make these materials available as well. Kathleen, we have any questions?
Yes, we have a couple more questions. I have a specific question about, we have a front desk person who is 74 years old, and we're going to put plexiglass up in front of them, give them all the PPP stuff, but ultimately, what happens if the employee is uncomfortable with coming back into that work environment? What are our options?
So if it's somebody who's sitting at the front desk, obviously that's not a job that can be done from home. I think it's having a conversation with this person. I guess firstly, is there any other position in the office that they can do instead that may or may not be feasible? If it's not, and you say to this person, look, we're taking every possible precaution, but we need somebody. This is a job that we physically need somebody to be present. And are you up for it? Do you want to do it? Or, look, I guess I would also say, unless they say otherwise, I would assume they are coming back. But you want to open up more broadly. I wouldn't target any one individual and say, you're old, what are you doing? Right? Instead, I would just, in terms of your messaging to your entire workforce, I would just say, look, if anybody has any concerns generally, come approach us. I would put the onus on the employee to come to you. And if in that situation, the employee does come to you, I think you'd say, look, we may not be, if you're not comfortable, we understand that, but we may not have a job for you then. We're going to need to find somebody else. We need somebody to sit at the desk. And if you're not able to do that, look, we will do what we can. But if you're going to say, I can't come back for 3 or 6 months, we can't necessarily guarantee that there will be a job for you.
And what are the legal ramifications of that? Right now,
again, yeah. Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Kathleen.
I was just going to say, right now, there's a lot of discussion about businesses' additional liability related to COVID, and that if somebody gets sick at the workplace, they're going to sue us. I mean, we really feel for businesses that are sensitive to the situation, and they're not really sure how they can protect themselves and, get their business back on track.
Sure. So again, in the normal course, as we said, if an employee gets sick at work and you are taking all reasonable steps to protect your employees by following these basic standards, that should be covered by workers' comp. There should not, in the normal course, be liability to an employer simply because an employee gets sick at work. So again, in that specific situation, I would not approach anybody in particular, but I would just say to everyone generally, if you have any specific concerns based on your circumstance, to let us know. I would have a conversation. And look, frankly, if this is somebody who's been working with you for 20 whatever years and you have a long-standing relationship, you may decide to be more flexible than somebody who is a shorter term employee or somebody who has performance issues. But at the end of the day, you're not required to hold open that person's job. And if they decide that they don't feel comfortable for whatever reason, you are within their right to say to them, look, I'm sorry, it's an unpleasant situation, but I wouldn't see that as leading to legal liability or exposure for the company.
Okay, so you're basically saying if an employee is uncomfortable with coming back to work and their job requires them to be on site, that we make the best accommodation, but that we can basically let them go without legal liability.
That's right. Because look, the job requires now, look, once again, this is location specific, but once, you're open for business and the state has allowed you to open for business, we need people to be present. And if an employee for whatever circumstance can't be present and it's not protected. So for example, again, if somebody has a protected because of the child care, they may be entitled to the 12 weeks. So that may be something, in one situation. But in the normal course, if an employee is just, for example, an older person and is just saying, I don't feel comfortable, it's a compelling situation. It's unfortunate, but there's no mandate that you hold their job open simply because they're an older person.
Okay, so then let's do the flip side of that. Let's assume I have an employee that's always sick and is in the vulnerable group, and I'm concerned about bringing them back to my workplace. Do I have any options? What's the best way to handle that?
So again, I wouldn't make assumptions. I would be open-ended to the entire workplace to say, if anybody has any specific situations, come to us. So the onus is on the employee to come to you. If one of those employees were to come to you and said, I have a pre-existing condition or I'm at heightened risk, I would say, well, look, let's see if we can, this is the typical sort of disability accommodation discussion. Well, what are you asking? And if you're asking for an accommodation to work from home, I would evaluate, and part of that is, look, it may not have been ideal, but what have you been doing? What has that person been doing for the past couple months? And if they've been working from home the past couple months, I think you're going to be harder pressed to say that they can't work from home, going forward, not necessarily indefinitely, but certainly for some extended period of time. If the person has not been working from home and it is a job that requires their presence, again, it may be that if they're receiving ongoing treatment, perhaps it's a serious medical condition under the federal FMLA and they need FMLA leave. That's one thing. If not, and it's just sort of, again, a basic disability accommodation discussion under, for example, the Americans with Disabilities Act, then again, you would reasonably accommodate, and an accommodation could be an unpaid leave of absence unless it's going to cause an undue hardship. And so that's the typical discussion that employers have in any situation where an employee says they need an accommodation, and sometimes you can do it and sometimes you can't. And it may be, again, a leave of absence, and when the employee is able to return, you can assess your staffing needs and see whether there's a position available or not.
Okay, so just to be clear, if I know the employee's vulnerable and I'm concerned as an employer with bringing them back, but they want to come back, do I have any ability to not allow them to come back? Because I don't want to have to, I don't think I can accommodate, or I don't think I can be to the level of cleanliness or security that I can protect them.
Unless that employee poses a direct health, risk of to the other employees, if the employee wants to come back, I think you would be hard pressed not to have the employee come back, unless there's some serious heightened risk. And that's why, again, when we're talking about these COVID situations where people are contagious, they're obviously not at a heightened risk just to themselves, but as to others. But just because somebody has, for example, diabetes or some other condition that's not a contagious condition, as long as you are taking all reasonably appropriate steps, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that the person cannot come back.
Okay, so then one last question I have is, I understand workers' comp is available for employees, but what happens if one of my employees gets sick and then passes it on to a family member? Does my company have a liability there?
So that's an open question. Generally speaking, you would say no, because again, that's the issue of causation. How are they going to show that they got it at work? But that is something that I think is precisely one of the open issues that's being discussed now in Congress, and this notion of a liability shield. I guess businesses are advocating for that because of the risk, as you say, to a family member, to a customer, just to a population. If you're going to be at any point having a large volume of people, and then there's some type of outbreak, businesses are understandably nervous about it. So there is no absolute answer on that just yet. And that's why, again, I think there are businesses who are advocating for, again, this term that's being referred to as a liability shield to protect businesses precisely in that type of situation.
Okay, that's all the questions I have. Ladies, do you have anything else you want to add?
Well, we appreciate everybody's time this morning, and thank you to Sax for inviting us to participate. And so thank you for that. Our contact information is on the materials that I know the folks at Sax will be sending out. And so if anybody has any follow-up questions, we're happy to answer any follow-up that anyone may have. So thank you for everyone's attention this morning.
Thank you.
And one more point to note, in the handout section of the GoToWebinar, you'll see the New York City Business Reopening Safety Plan that you can download right on your desktop right now, for those of you that would like to get a copy of that plan. Also, I'd like to thank Lauren and Julie for the presentation. Thank you for the thoughtful, provoking conversation about our next steps going back to the workplace. And if anyone has a topic that they think would be good for us to present at our CFO series, I'd like you to please send me your suggestions. My email is kalexander@saxllp.com, or you can go right to our website and click on my link. This ends the program for today. I want to thank you for joining us, and from all of us at Sax, we wish you the best and hope you can join us for our next CFO series seminar. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.